one is the book, obviously, but also the relationship between author and editor, and how it evolved and what it entails, so I thought we would come back to the book, but I thought we would begin with your relationship. And so when did
my wife is
so when did the two of you fall in love?
Oh, wow.
And how did you meet? Can you tell me a little about it? Was there an agent involved? What happened?
Well, when did you start reading books? 1999. 99, okay, so I've been there for 26 years. I've been there, I published my first book there in 1994. And Cal came on board, and my first book was a nonfiction book, but I desperately wanted to be a novelist. And so when I wrote a novel, Cal became the editor of it. And actually, when I finally succeeded writing a novel, I'd actually started Beautiful Ruins in 1997, and it had hit a brick wall. And then I started another novel, and it also hadn't worked. So I wrote a literary crime novel called Overtumbled Graves. And was that the first book you edited? Yeah. And Cal was the editor, and it was, from the very first, it was someone, as any young writer, any writer knows, you just want someone to take you seriously and make your work better. And that was the very first, I still remember the first editorial letter I got from it, which praised all those things that I thought I had done well, and identified some blind spots that I suspected I had. And when you find an editor like that, you don't want to be.
That's nice of you to say. But it was. I actually remember the phone call, or maybe an email, but I think it was a phone call where you first, and we hadn't really worked together in any great detail. I think I was maybe doing a paperback reissue of your nonfiction book, and you said to me in a way that I, from my perspective, took to be a little subversive for reasons I'll explain. Would you be willing to look at a novel of mine? Because you were at that point sort of a nonfiction writer for us, and the truth is the imprint where I worked at the time was largely a nonfiction imprint. We had a couple of fiction writers, but our assignment very clearly was to do a lot of big nonfiction bestsellers, or a lot of very big commercial books, and yet I wanted to publish fiction, and there's sort of secret place in my heart that I only got to indulge in very seldom, every so often. And so when you called, I knew already to be a very good writer, but I hadn't realized you were writing fiction at all, and so we'll be able to see this. I thought, well, yes, and I just won't tell anybody until I've read it and begun to think about how it might be published in these circumstances. And the good news was, long before I was your fan, Judith Regan, who was the publisher at the imprint, was already a deeply dyed Jess Walter fan and a big sponsor of yours. And so I was just luckily the person who got to read it first and got to, I think, work with you sort of most intensely on revising the book. And it was an enormous thrill from day one because Jess had already brought the book so far down the field that by the time I got there, all I really had to do was ask a couple of questions, and we had what was just an absolute terrific book.
The other thing I remember, I don't know if you remember this or not, but that book, Overtumbled Graves, was filled with all of my literary ambition, even though it's kind of a police procedural. And so, as I explained to Cal, the title comes from The Wasteland, and every chapter, there are 5 chapters, it begins in April, like The Wasteland, and all the characters' names come from The Wasteland, and it's really an homage to The Wasteland. There was a pause, and he said, "You might not tell people that." Going out with my thriller, with my Wasteland thriller, but but it was that was the hard thing, was switching. Having any kind of success in publishing is so hard, and having a successful nonfiction book, that was the path that was sort of drawn for me, and I didn't want that. I wanted to be a fiction writer, so having an ally, and having someone there to make it possible to make it grow slightly better was so important.
One day, I'm curious, you're welcome to come teach in our Crime Fiction Academy anytime. We can maybe have a class on using Milton or something.
Yeah, right.
But what made you make that switch from crime? If your first book of fiction was a police procedural. Why didn't you carry on in that?
I am largely self-taught. I didn't get an MFA. I lived my whole life in Spokane, Washington, and I tried to write. I always saw myself as a literary fiction writer, and the first book, after this book failed and after another one failed, they felt too elaborate to me, and I thought, what can I do? What kind of book can I write that, every writer says write what you know, and I've been a police reporter. But I also wanted something that was loaded with conflict, so I wouldn't have to invent conflict between people. Well, maybe she slept with his brother, and maybe, instead somebody's killed somebody. And if it's a serial killer, they've killed a lot of buddies. And so that seemed like an easy way to load the thing with conflict, and to have a sort of kind of scaffolding that could keep me going as a writer. I would constantly start things and then they would fall away because I just didn't believe them anymore. And so that book is 58 chapters. They're really short chapters, and that's exactly how long I could sustain my disbelief in myself, long enough to write those sections. And when I finished it, I thought it was a literary crime novel along the lines of Richard Price, and that's what I felt like I was writing. There aren't a whole lot of Richard Prices, and when I look back at it, it's much more procedural than I ever wanted to. But my goal was always to write literary fiction. Even when I was working at the newspaper, I was sending out short stories. I used to call them Manila boomerangs. And I would throw them out, and 3 weeks later they'd come back. And for 7 years, I sent out short stories and got everyone rejected, except by my friends who ran Yacht magazine. They took one. And then I had a story that finished in 25th place in the Story Magazine contest called Flashers, Floaters, and Vitreous Detachment, which became Brian Remy's commission. When you see those flashers and streaks. And so after 7 years, it wasn't a yes, they didn't publish it, but it was a check for $25 and a mention in the magazine. And I didn't cash the check, I put it on my bulletin board, and it still sits there today. You are a pro now. $25. So I always wanted to be a literary fiction writer, but I felt like I didn't know the way to get there, and crime fiction seemed like a more accessible form.
Do you remember your reaction, Cal, reading that first fiction manuscript?
Oh yeah, we were just talking about this before we came over, sitting in the bar next door. It amazed me from the beginning, and this was true of both Over Tumble Graves and then to Blind, your second book, which was also a police procedural, also set in bookends, several of the same characters actually. So we managed to persuade people who asked that we may have had the start of a series here. But they were both extraordinary character novels. They were emotionally complex. They were, while they were satisfying, I think, most or all of the things you want out of a suspense novel, out of a crime novel, they were actually, to my mind, satisfying in entirely different ways that had to do with the dreams of all the characters and the sort of distance between those dreams and where their lives have eventually gone. And when I think about it now, and it's interesting because a lot of the very, very savvy, terrific reviews that Beautiful Ruins has been receiving have articulated something that's been true of Jess's writing all along, which is that he is a kind of a poet of that distance between people's dreams and people's lives. And that was true, especially I think of Land of the Blind, which his second book, which is a very personal book, I think, in a lot of ways. It was a book that, in a sense, brought Jess and I think, a little bit closer together because it's a book about, and among many, many other things, vision problems, which has kind of been a theme in a few of your books. And Jess and I, growing up, both had versions of eye problems and vision problems of our own. So both of those first two books spoke to me in these kind of very personal ways. And I was almost even a little shy about sharing with Jess because I didn't want him to think that I liked his book just because of idiosyncratic things that were to do with me. But then when I saw other people reading them and reviewers and writers we would send the books to for blurbs, it became clear to me that the people who were responding, both in the reviews and in the blurbs that we got from books, the people who were responding in the way that I did to the books were the people who were reading them for character and for the much more literary qualities.
Yeah, this distance between how people live their lives and what they dream their life might be is so evident in this book, Beautiful Ruins. It makes it so beautiful. It makes the ending so, well, I won't spoil the ending for you, but, but everyone is murdered, you know. But do you, when you set out to do that, this book is actually, it reads very cleanly, but it's actually an incredibly complex book structurally. There's a lot going on in the book. And do you consciously plan how you're going to move into that space, that kind of poetic space at the end, right from the beginning, where you're going to tie all these things together, or does it just evolve?
This is a really difficult book to draw any sort of conclusions from, because I started and stopped it so many times, and this was the book that bedeviled me for 15 years, and every time I set it down, I never thought, well, I'll go back to that someday. I thought, well, that book's dead. I've killed that one, and I've got to write something else. And it was probably only the last time that I finished it that I thought, so I finished a draft in 2008, and I thought, oh, I've got it. And then I read through it, and I gave it to, I don't think I even showed it to you, did I? No, I gave it to my first reader, a college professor friend of mine, and he agreed with me that it wasn't very good. In fact, he agreed with me a little too hard, and it hurt my feelings, because he would usually say, no, it's good, it's good. He's like, no, you're right, it's not there. It's kind of there. No, you're right the first time. So, and it was elaborate even then. It was these, and it's funny because it's elaborate in structure, but I think it's actually quite linear in the way it deals with these characters. It just brings these other voices in to tell the story of what happens to this couple, and whether or not there can be a moment so profound that 50 years later you're still thinking about that person. That was the question I posed and wanted to answer, and without being too sappily romantic about it. And but when I hit that wall and it wasn't working in 2008, it just felt as if the pieces didn't quite fit together, and I knew I needed to take another run at it. And then, and I rewrite obsessively. So when I went back to it in 2000, I wrote The Financial Lives of the Poets to kind of get this book out of my system. I wrote that in a short amount of time. And then when I went back to this, I pretty much tore it down to the very beginning. Stripped the paint, sanded it down, got all new parts, and then built it back up again. And so I think it seems smoother and more linear than it is, partly because it went through so many revisions and rewrites, and each of those pieces went through those revisions and rewrites. And then, of course, I sent it to Cal, and he echoed what the first guy said. It's not very good. No, he was very helpful, and then had some more things to tweak with at the end. So yeah, it's hard to trace sort of original intent. I didn't know exactly how all these stories would come together. When I was working on it in 2008, I got to go back to Italy for the second time, which is where much of the novel takes place. And I had one of those nights of epiphanies. I went and drank with my professor friend, and we talked about the book. We hiked the Cinque Terre, and that night I stayed up and I wrote 26 pages in my writing journal about what should happen in this book. And I toward the end, I wrote about how it should all end in this swirling present tense that brings all the characters together and is like spilling all their lives out on a table. All those people we met, here they all are. And I remember that image and wanted to try to capture that.
Cal, did you work with Jess differently on this book than you worked with him on his other books? Was the process pretty much the same?
Well, working with Jess has been, I think, probably the sort of the most visible proof to me of something that I feel like I've discovered sort of in the career of my editor, in my career as an editor, and most pointedly with Jess, which is that I have discovered with every new book, which is that every new editorial job you do, you have to invent a few new editorial tools to use on that job. The sort of great, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, where Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and invented the principle of mass production. That is the opposite of what you do in fiction. You cannot actually use just the tools you brought with you from the last job to work on a new book. You end up having to absorb everything you can about the book, sort of feel out where things might be slightly awry, and usually there's, with Jess, very, very little, and what there is at a kind of a high level of nuance and complexity. And you have to, as an editor, sort of earn enough of a sense of shared mission and enough of a sense of shared understanding of the book that you can sort of dig down into what those issues are. And I've thought a little bit about, especially in the past couple of books, about the ways that Jess and I have come at working on the editorial challenges with each new book. And the one that always sticks out in my mind is that when we were working together on The Zero, which was Jess's fourth novel, there were the two crime novels, Overcome the Graves and Land of the Blind, and then there was the book called Citizen Vince, which was in a sense a transitional novel because it was set very much in a sort of a crime setting, but it was also very clearly a literary novel, and a very funny novel, your most comic novel of the first three. And then the next book was this book called The Zero, which was an incredibly ambitious, deeply moving, and harrowing novel, but that one on an editorial level had a special challenge because it was a deeply complex structure. And it was the first of your books that had that level of complexity. And I realized as an editor, I couldn't begin to tell this guy the first thing about what might be awry at any point in the book until I understood it myself. And the average reader isn't necessarily always called upon to have to understand a book at a level of that, at that level of complexity, but an editor sort of has to. So I remember exactly where I was when I did it. I was sitting in my sort of reading room in our apartment in Jackson Heights, Queens at the time, and I sat down after reading the book a couple of times and made myself a flow chart, which I then eventually had to type into, sort of a workable form in an editorial letter of these two parallel storylines that book had. And there's one kind of actual real-time storyline, and then this kind of dream state, fugue state storyline that the main character, Brian Remy, was in at the same, and I had to try to map carefully enough the divergences and transitions between those two parallel stories that I could say to Jess, here's a place where I'm not sure that that's scanning, or here's a place where you might be trying to accomplish one of two different things here, and I need to know which one it is so we can get it all the way there. That was a set of tools that I had to figure out how to invent before even being able to talk with Jess about it. I may use that set of tools one more time in my career. I don't know if I ever will. They're back in the drawer. With Beautiful Ruins, it was somewhat easier because I think the book was enormously polished by the time I got to it, and the structure in particular, there was not a place in the book where the structure wasn't, or all the gears weren't already meshing in the ways that you would want them to. So I think Jess had taken on a lot of the work that he could very easily have just laid on me, and I would have sat down with my toolbox and tried to figure it out. And I think it was all those years working on it that it got me.
There was and we have to sort of backtrack. After Land of the Blind, I was, which didn't sell very well, and I finished Citizen Vince, and Barnes & Noble ordered, Zero. And I just got an agent. He said, I said, what do you do in this situation? He said, well, some authors change their names. I'm 24 years old now. I said, have I really ruined this name? Is it I'm not saying you do that. I'm saying, sometimes, if your sales record has gone like that, then you might have to write under pseudonym. And I remember just thinking, oh, this is the end. I hit a dead end. And then Citizen Vince did pretty well, and The Zero was a very difficult book. And unfortunately, readers also need that flowchart. No. It's actually, I think, much more accessible than that. But I remember Cal and I have set up this, and this is the only editor I've worked with on novels, so I don't know if every editor does this, but I'll show him part of the book, and then later I'll send him the whole book. And when I showed my agent part of the book, he said, I'm not sure, it's a very dark satire about our reaction to terrorism set at Ground Zero. It's very irreverent and in your face in some ways. It's a a difficult book, especially to start. And my agent said, I don't know if I can sell this. And my wife said, I don't think you can publish this. I think they'll Dixie chick you. I think they'll send you to jail. And I remember sending it to Cal, and he was one of the first people who saw maybe 80 pages and said, no, this is brilliant. This is great. You need to follow through with this. And that, just having that, and then my other favorite part is the editorial letter that Cal always sends, which is so great because I can't wait for Cal to tell me what it is I was doing, because often I have a sense, but I love to hear his. He will make connections that I've only made intuitively sometimes, or and often he'll find the connections that I put there that I hoped a reader would find. And you always talk about, people always ask, who do you write for? Do you have a reader that you write for? And getting Cal's editorial letter, which somehow he always knows just how much praise to put on top before you have to, it's like a meat pie before you dig into the vegetables. And there's always just enough, this is working well, you did this just right. And then we get into the stuff that's completely incomprehensible that I have to change. So I always loved getting those. And I remember specifically with the Zero, it felt like I almost more novel than I could write at the time. And so to have Cal looking over my shoulder and saying, this part's working, you don't need this might work better here. That was a great help.
Yeah. One thing you said, made me think of Cal's work in general. Cal, you're incredibly risk-taking. If you look at your list of writers you added, you said, everyone else said the Zero is not going to work. You said, oh, it's brilliant, let's go ahead. You like Butler, you take risks all the time as an editor. What's the story with that? Is that an addiction?
I'm not sure I always know that they're risks, so it may be more just sort of blind stumbling into things. But I'm very drawn to people who want to do bold things, and on the page. And I'm also drawn to, every editor I think has weaknesses for writers who do certain kinds of things very, very well. And I happen to be drawn to writers who do language very well, and who write about society very well, and who have a degree of generosity toward their characters. And I think those are three things that I really respond to. I tend not, for example, to be, I'm not a big plot-driven reader or plot-driven editor, which is why I don't have, 10 different book-a-year best-selling, #1 best-selling authors all the time. But what I have are authors who try something new with every book and who surprise me and, who sometimes surprise the sales department in a good way and sometimes surprise the sales department that, will we publish that? Is that even on our list? I'm not sure. Did we sell any copies? But it is a set of weaknesses that I have that I think makes for a lot of fun for me, because every new book is a new experience.